Laura Thompson sat by the large kitchen window, the soft morning light filtering through the delicate lace curtains. At 45 years old, she was a picture of contentment, or so it seemed. With her rich auburn hair beginning to show streaks of silver, she exuded a calm, serene beauty that had deepened with age. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. Her life in the small town of Bedford, nestled in the English countryside, was tranquil and predictable, much like the garden outside, where neat rows of flowers bloomed in harmonious order. She had a loving husband, Richard, who had always been her rock. Their marriage was the envy of many, steady, warm, and built on years of mutual respect and love. They had no children, a choice they both had come to terms with long ago, finding joy instead in each other's company and the simple pleasures of life. Richard was the kind of man who could make her laugh with just a look, and for Laura that had always been enough. But beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life, Laura harbored a secret longing, a dream she had nurtured in the quiet corners of her heart for as long as she could remember. She loved to bake. It was more than just a hobby. It was her passion. Her cakes, pies, and pastries were the stuff of local legend, sought after by friends and neighbors alike. Yet, despite the constant encouragement from Richard and others to start her own business, Laura was paralyzed by fear. What if I fail? She would ask herself, staring at the kitchen counter covered in flour and sugar. The fear of failure had always been her shadow, whispering doubts and worries that kept her dream at bay. Richard, ever supportive, would often say, "You're amazing at what you do, Laura. The whole town knows it. Imagine how wonderful it would be to share your gift with even more people." She would smile, but the fear remained, an uninvited guest that never left. Laura's life was comfortable, and she was grateful for it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through her fingers. The dream of opening her own bakery, of seeing her name on a little storefront on the high street, had never faded. It was there every time she mixed batter, every time she decorated a cake, every time she saw someone's face light up with delight after tasting one of her creations. Yet, despite the longing, she could never bring herself to take that final step. The bakery remained a dream, a beautiful what-if that she couldn't quite reach out and grasp. The thought of putting herself out there, of risking everything she had built, was terrifying. It was easier, safer, to stay within the bounds of her quiet, predictable life. Then, one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. The autumn air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the scent of leaves turning gold and the faint hint of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Laura loved this time of year, the way the world seemed to prepare itself for the quietude of winter. On this particular morning, she was bustling about her kitchen, preparing Richard's favorite lemon drizzle cake. The rhythm of baking soothed her, each step familiar and comforting. As the cake baked, she poured herself a cup of tea and settled at the kitchen table. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of oldies and local news, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts of the bakery she still dreamed of. She imagined it often, a cozy little shop, the air always fragrant with the smell of fresh bread and pastries. It would be painted a soft pastel, with large windows that let in the sunlight. A place where people could come to enjoy a warm cup of tea and a slice of cake, to escape the hustle and bustle of the world for a little while. The sound of the front door opening broke her reverie. Richard had returned from his morning walk. It was a routine they had settled into after he retired early from his job as a civil engineer. Richard was a man who thrived on structure, and his daily walks were a cherished part of his day. He would come home, have a second breakfast, and they would talk about their plans, though their plans rarely changed. But today, there was something different in the way the door clicked shut, something unsettling in the heavy thud of his boots on the wooden floor. Laura looked up as he entered the kitchen, his face pale, his usually vibrant eyes dull. "Richard?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer immediately, moving slowly to sit down at the table across from her. He looked at her, his expression distant, as if he was struggling to find the right words. "Laura, I don't feel well," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a chill down her spine. Richard was rarely ill, and when he was, he would brush it off as nothing. But there was a gravity in his tone that alarmed her. She reached across the table to take his hand, feeling the coolness of his skin. "What is it? Should we call the doctor?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel panic rising in her chest. "I think maybe I should lie down for a bit," he replied, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Laura stood quickly, her heart pounding. "Let me help you upstairs." Richard nodded, but as he tried to stand, his legs buckled beneath him. Laura caught him just in time, her own strength fueled by fear. Somehow, she managed to half-carry, half-drag him to the living room sofa, laying him down as gently as she could. He was shaking now, his face slick with sweat, and his breathing was becoming more labored by the second. "Richard, I'm calling an ambulance," she said, her voice trembling. He tried to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Laura ran to the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. The minutes that followed felt like a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. The paramedics arrived quickly, their professionalism a stark contrast to Laura's frantic state. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking Richard's vitals, asking her questions she could barely answer, her mind racing with terror. "It looks like a heart attack," one of them said, his voice calm yet urgent. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Laura could only nod, her voice lost somewhere in the storm of emotions that had overtaken her. She watched as they loaded Richard onto a stretcher, her heart screaming with fear and helplessness. In the blink of an eye, her world had tilted on its axis, and nothing made sense anymore. She followed the ambulance to the hospital in her own car, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The drive was a blur, her mind replaying the last few moments in a loop, Richard's pale face, his whispered words, the terrifying look in his eyes. She had never felt so powerless, so utterly unprepared for what was happening. When she arrived at the hospital, they whisked Richard away into the emergency room, leaving her in a sterile waiting area that felt like a world apart from the life she had known just hours before. Time lost all meaning as she sat there, her thoughts a chaotic mess of fear, hope, and denial. Every time a door opened, she would look up, her heart leaping into her throat, only to sink back down when it wasn't the news she was waiting for. Finally, a doctor approached, his expression serious but not unkind. Laura stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She knew, even before he spoke, that this was not going to be the news she had prayed for. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice gentle. "We did everything we could, but your husband's heart was too damaged. He didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt, the words not registering at first. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if that could change the reality. "No, he was fine this morning. He was fine." "I'm very sorry," the doctor repeated, his eyes filled with sympathy. Laura felt her knees give way, and she sank into the nearest chair, her body trembling uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. But the crushing finality of the doctor's words left no room for doubt. Richard, her beloved Richard, was gone. The life she had known, the life they had built together, was shattered in an instant. And in the middle of the debris, Laura was left alone. Her dream of the bakery now a distant, insignificant thought compared to the overwhelming grief that consumed her. The days that followed Richard's death passed in a haze. Laura felt like she was moving through a fog, each moment disconnected from the next. She barely remembered the funeral, a blur of somber faces, whispered condolences, and the suffocating weight of loss pressing down on her from all sides. Friends and neighbors had come to pay their respects, their words a meaningless hum in her ears. She responded in the way she thought she was supposed to, nodding, murmuring thank you, but inside, she felt nothing. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now seemed unbearably silent. Richard's absence was everywhere, in the empty chair at the kitchen table, in the untouched newspapers he used to read, in the bed that now felt too big and too cold. Laura moved through her days mechanically, performing the necessary tasks of living, but each action felt hollow. She cooked meals she didn't eat, cleaned rooms she no longer cared about, and spent hours staring out the window at the garden that Richard had lovingly tended. Grief was a heavy, suffocating thing. It wrapped itself around her, seeping into every part of her life. Nights were the worst. Lying in bed, the darkness pressing in around her, she would reach out instinctively for Richard, only to find the space beside her empty. The loneliness was a physical pain, a gnawing ache that wouldn't let her sleep. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every moment of that last day, searching for something she could have done differently, something that could have kept him here with her. Friends tried to help. They brought meals she didn't want, offered company she couldn't bear, and tried to encourage her to get out of the house. "You need to keep busy, Laura," they would say. "Come for a walk with us. It'll do you good." But Laura couldn't summon the energy to care. The world outside seemed like a distant, alien place, and she had no desire to be part of it. She retreated further into herself, finding a strange kind of comfort in the isolation. The house became her refuge, the walls closing in around her, shutting out the world. Days passed, then weeks, and the routine of grief became familiar. She would wake up each morning, feeling the weight of Richard's absence like a stone in her chest. She would move through the day in a daze, her thoughts always circling back to him. At night, she would lie in the darkness, waiting for the dawn, wondering how she was supposed to go on without him. But as the initial shock of loss began to dull, something else started to creep into her consciousness. It was small at first, just a flicker of an idea at the back of her mind. It was a thought she had pushed away for so long, buried beneath layers of fear and doubt. But now, in the quiet of her grief, it began to resurface. The bakery, the dream that had once seemed so unattainable, now loomed large in her mind. It was as if Richard's death had stripped away the excuses, the reasons she had always found not to pursue it. What was there left to lose? She had already lost the most important thing in her life. The thought of the bakery became a lifeline, something to cling to in the midst of her sorrow. At first, the idea terrified her. How could she possibly do this on her own? Richard had always been her support, her safety net. Without him, the world seemed a much scarier place. But there was also a small, insistent voice in the back of her mind that whispered, "If not now, when?" The fear of failure was still there, but now it was accompanied by something stronger, the fear of regret. Laura began to realize that she had spent so much of her life holding back, letting her fears dictate her choices. Richard had always believed in her, always encouraged her to follow her passion. And now, in the silence left by his absence, she could almost hear his voice urging her on. "You can do this, Laura," she imagined him saying. His voice as clear in her mind as if he were standing right beside her. "You've always been stronger than you think." The thought brought tears to her eyes, but it also brought a flicker of determination. For the first time in weeks, Laura felt something other than grief. A spark of hope, however small. The idea of the bakery began to take shape in her mind. No longer just a distant dream, but something real, something she could reach out and grasp. She started small, gathering her thoughts, making lists of what she would need to do. There were licenses to apply for, a location to find, equipment to buy. The list was daunting, and every time she looked at it, the old fears would resurface, threatening to pull her back into the safety of inaction. But each time, she pushed through the fear, reminding herself that this was something she had to do, for herself and for Richard. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and plans, she opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was of her and Richard, taken on their honeymoon in Italy. They were standing in front of a little bakery in a small village, the kind of place that had inspired her dream all those years ago. In the photo, they were both smiling, their faces lit up with the excitement of the moment. She stared at the photo for a long time, her heart aching with the loss, but also filled with a new resolve. Richard had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And now it was time to honor that belief. It was time to take the first step toward the dream that had always been just out of reach. With a deep breath, Laura made a decision. Tomorrow, she would start looking for a location. It was the first concrete step toward making the bakery a reality. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered by a sense of purpose, a determination to move forward despite the uncertainty. For the first time since Richard's death, Laura felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new out of the ashes of her old life. The following morning, Laura woke with a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't the same as the joy she used to feel, nor the comfort of her life with Richard, but it was something, a small, flickering light in the darkness of her grief. She got out of bed, dressed, and made herself a cup of tea, her movements more deliberate than they had been in days. Today, she would begin the search for a location for her bakery. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, Laura opened her laptop and began searching for available properties in Bedford. It was a small town with a close-knit community, and she knew that finding the right place would be crucial. The bakery had to feel welcoming, a place where people would want to gather, a place that could become a part of the town's fabric. After a few hours of scrolling through listings and making notes, Laura came across a property that caught her eye. It was a quaint little shop on the high street, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The exterior was charming, with ivy growing up the sides and a small garden in front. It looked like the kind of place where you could imagine spending hours, sipping coffee and chatting with friends. Laura's heart skipped a beat as she studied the photos. This was exactly what she had been envisioning, the perfect setting for her dream. Without allowing herself time to second-guess, she picked up the phone and called the estate agent. "Hello, I'm calling about the property on the high street, the one with the garden out front," she said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Yes, that's still available," the agent replied, sounding pleased. "Would you like to schedule a viewing?" "I would," Laura said, her heart pounding in her chest. "As soon as possible." They arranged to meet that afternoon, and as Laura hung up the phone, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. This was it. She was really doing it. There was no turning back now. When she arrived at the property later that day, the agent was already there, waiting by the door. He was a tall man with a kind smile, and he greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Thompson, it's a pleasure to meet you," he said, shaking her hand. "Shall we take a look inside?" "Yes, please," Laura replied, trying to hide her nerves. As they stepped inside, Laura was struck by the cozy, welcoming atmosphere of the space. The main room was spacious yet intimate, with high ceilings and wooden beams that gave it a rustic charm. The light streaming in through the windows made the room feel warm and inviting, and she could already picture the shelves lined with cakes and pastries, the tables filled with customers enjoying a quiet moment in their day. "There's a small kitchen in the back," the agent said, leading her through a door at the rear of the shop. "It's not large, but it's fully equipped and should be perfect for a bakery." Laura followed him into the kitchen, her mind racing with possibilities. It was smaller than the kitchen at home, but it had everything she would need: a sturdy oven, ample counter space, and a walk-in pantry. It was perfect. "This is wonderful," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's exactly what I've been looking for." The agent smiled. "I'm glad you like it. The property has a lot of potential, and with the right touch, it could be something really special." "Are you thinking of opening a bakery?" "Yes," Laura said, feeling a surge of pride as she spoke the words aloud. "It's something I've always wanted to do." "Well, I think you've found the perfect place," the agent said. "The location is excellent, right in the heart of town with plenty of foot traffic. And the community here is very supportive of local businesses. I think you do very well." Laura nodded, her excitement growing with each passing moment. It was as if the pieces were finally falling into place, and she could see the outlines of her dream taking shape. But then, as she looked around the shop, a familiar doubt crept in. "What if I can't do it?" she thought, the fear returning with a vengeance. "What if it's too much? What if I fail?" The questions swirled in her mind, threatening to drown out the excitement. But then she remembered Richard's voice, his unwavering belief in her, and she knew she couldn't let fear stop her now. Not after everything she had been through, not when she was so close. Taking a deep breath, Laura turned to the agent. "I'll take it," she said, her voice steady with resolve. "Wonderful," the agent replied, clearly pleased. "We can start the paperwork immediately." As they discussed the details, Laura felt a sense of calm settle over her. This was the right decision. She knew it in her heart. For the first time since Richard's death, she felt like she was moving forward, like she was building something new, something that would honor his memory and give her life new meaning. Over the next few weeks, Laura threw herself into the process of setting up the bakery. There were countless decisions to make. Choosing a name, designing the interior, selecting suppliers, but she found that keeping busy helped to keep the grief at bay. Every time she felt overwhelmed, she would remind herself why she was doing this, and the determination would return. She decided to name the bakery Sweet Remembrances, a tribute to the memories she and Richard had shared, and to the sweet moments she hoped to create for others. The name felt right, a way to keep Richard close, even as she moved into this new chapter of her life. One evening, as she stood in the middle of the shop, surrounded by paint cans and fabric swatches, Laura felt a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, though the grief was still there, always there. It was a tear of gratitude, of hope, of the realization that she was finally doing what she had always dreamed of, even if it had taken a tragedy to push her to this point. She wiped the tear away, smiling to herself as she imagined Richard standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his voice in her ear saying, "I knew you could do it." The weeks leading up to the grand opening of Sweet Remembrances were a whirlwind of activity. Laura had poured every ounce of energy into transforming the quaint little shop into a cozy, inviting space. She had chosen soft pastel colors for the walls, adding touches of floral patterns that gave the bakery a warm, homey feel. The shelves were lined with delicate porcelain teapots and vintage cake stands, each piece carefully selected to create the perfect atmosphere. In the back of the shop, the kitchen had become her sanctuary. The smell of freshly baked bread, cakes, and pastries filled the air, bringing with it a sense of comfort that Laura hadn't felt in a long time. As she perfected her recipes and experimented with new ones, she found herself thinking of Richard. Every batch of cookies, every loaf of bread, felt like a tribute to him, a way of keeping his spirit alive in the work she loved. Opening day arrived sooner than she expected. As she stood in the doorway, looking out at the high street, her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. What if no one came? What if it was a disaster? But she quickly pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the love and care she had put into every detail of the bakery. At 9 a.m. sharp, she unlocked the door and flipped the sign to open. The first hour was quiet, with only a few passers-by stopping to glance in the window. Laura busied herself behind the counter, arranging the pastries and wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning, anything to keep her mind from spiraling into doubt. She had just started to wonder if anyone would show up when the doorbell chimed. "Good morning," a cheerful voice called out. Laura looked up to see Mrs. Green, one of her neighbors, stepping into the shop. The elderly woman's face lit up as she took in the surroundings. "Oh, Laura, it's lovely," Mrs. Green exclaimed, making her way to the counter. "It feels so warm and welcoming in here, and the smell, heavenly." Laura's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. I'm so glad you came by. Can I offer you a slice of our lemon drizzle cake? It's freshly made this morning." Mrs. Green nodded eagerly. "That sounds wonderful. I'll take a pot of tea as well." As Laura served her first customer, a sense of calm washed over her. This was where she belonged, sharing her love of baking with others. One by one, more customers trickled in, friends, neighbors, curious townsfolk, all eager to sample her creations. The steady stream of patrons brought with it a flurry of activity, and before long, the shop was filled with the sound of clinking teacups and lively conversation. By midday, Sweet Remembrances was buzzing with life. The tables were full, and Laura found herself moving from one task to the next with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Each time she handed over a plate of scones or poured a cup of coffee, she felt a little of the weight she had been carrying lift. The bakery wasn't just a dream anymore. It was real, and it was thriving. But as the day wore on, Laura realized that running a business was more challenging than she had anticipated. There were moments when the pressure of keeping up with orders, managing the kitchen, and ensuring that every customer was happy felt overwhelming. The old fears began to creep back in. What if she couldn't keep this up? What if she wasn't cut out for this after all? The doubts grew stronger when the lunch rush hit. The bakery was packed, and the orders kept coming faster than Laura could manage. The coffee machine broke down just as a group of tourists arrived, eager for their afternoon pick-me-up. One of the ovens started acting up, burning a batch of cookies that had been meant for a special order. And to top it all off, the cash register jammed, leaving her fumbling with change while the line grew longer. Laura's hands shook as she tried to keep everything under control, but the frustration and panic were building inside her. She felt like she was spinning out of control, the dream she had worked so hard to build slipping through her fingers. Just as she was about to break down, the door swung open, and a familiar face stepped inside. It was Jane, her best friend since childhood, who had taken the day off work to be there for Laura's big day. "Hey, I thought you might need a hand," Jane said, taking one look at Laura's frazzled expression. Without waiting for a response, she shrugged off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped behind the counter. "What can I do?" Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Jane, you're a lifesaver," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Can you handle the coffee orders? The machine's on the fritz, and I—" "Don't worry, I've got it," Jane said with a reassuring smile. "You just focus on the baking. We'll get through this together." With Jane's help, the afternoon went much more smoothly. Laura could focus on what she did best, baking, and Jane took charge of the front of the house, charming the customers and keeping everything running smoothly. By the time the last customer left and Laura flipped the sign to closed, she was exhausted but grateful. As she and Jane sat at one of the tables, enjoying a cup of tea and a slice of cake, Laura finally allowed herself to breathe. The day had been far from perfect, but she had survived it, and that was something. "Thank you, Jane," Laura said, her voice soft with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you today." Jane waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please, I was happy to help. You've done something amazing here, Laura. You should be proud of yourself." Laura nodded, but the doubts still lingered. "It's just so much harder than I thought it would be. I don't know if I'm cut out for this." Jane reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You are, Laura. You've already done the hardest part. You started. The rest will come with time. You just need to give yourself a break and remember that you don't have to do it all on your own." As Laura looked around the shop, now quiet and still after the busy day, she realized that Jane was right. She had taken the first step, and that was something to be proud of. There would be challenges ahead, but she had faced worse and survived. And she had people who believed in her, who were willing to help her along the way. For the first time since Richard's death, Laura felt a glimmer of hope for the future. A future she was starting to believe in again. The days following the grand opening of Sweet Remembrances were a whirlwind. Word spread quickly through Bedford, and soon the little bakery became a beloved spot for locals and visitors alike. Mornings were filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, cinnamon rolls, and muffins, while afternoons saw a steady stream of customers coming in for a slice of cake or a cup of tea. Despite the initial challenges, Laura began to settle into a routine. Each morning, she would arrive at the shop before dawn, her heart still heavy but her resolve strong. There was a peace in those early hours, the town still asleep as she worked alone in the kitchen, kneading dough and preparing the day's offerings. The rhythmic motions of baking, the familiar smells and sounds, brought her a sense of comfort. It was in these quiet moments that she felt closest to Richard, as if he were there with her, guiding her hands as she worked. The bakery quickly became a second home for Laura. The community embraced her, and she found herself reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. Mrs. Green became a regular, stopping by each morning for her pot of tea and a chat. A group of young mothers formed a routine of meeting at the bakery after dropping their children off at school, turning it into a lively gathering spot. And the tourists, drawn by the charm of the town and the scent of fresh pastries, filled the shop with their laughter and stories. But as the bakery flourished, Laura continued to struggle with the weight of grief. The bustling days were a welcome distraction, but the nights were still long and lonely. The quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts often brought back the pain of losing Richard. She missed him with an ache that never truly went away, even when she was surrounded by people. One particularly hard evening, after the shop had closed and the silence of the empty bakery settled in, Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the last slice of lemon drizzle cake from the day. It was Richard's favorite, the one she had made for him countless times. She picked up a fork and took a bite, letting the familiar flavors wash over her. But instead of comfort, it brought a fresh wave of sorrow. She pushed the plate away, burying her face in her hands. "Richard, I don't know how to do this without you," she whispered, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "I thought starting the bakery would help, that it would make me feel closer to you, but it's so hard. I miss you so much." The tears came in earnest now, the grief she had kept at bay all day crashing over her. She had tried so hard to be strong, to move forward, but in moments like this the loss felt overwhelming. She longed to hear Richard's voice, to feel his arms around her, to share with him the joys and struggles of this new venture. The bakery had been their dream, something they had often talked about doing together, and now she was doing it alone. After a long while, when the tears had finally slowed, Laura sat back in her chair, exhausted. She wiped her eyes and looked around the bakery, taking in the fruits of her labor. The cozy chairs, the colorful displays, the shelves lined with cakes and pastries. All of it was hers, a testament to her hard work and determination. And yet, it still felt like something was missing. She knew she couldn't continue like this, pushing herself to the brink every day and then collapsing into despair every night. She needed help, not just in running the bakery, but in dealing with her grief. Richard had always been the one she leaned on, but now she had to find strength within herself, and that was proving to be the hardest part of all. The next morning, Laura made a decision. She needed to find a way to balance the demands of the bakery with the need to take care of herself. She couldn't do it all alone, and she had to stop trying to. When Jane arrived later that morning for their regular coffee date, Laura hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Jane, can I ask you something?" Laura began, her voice uncertain. "Of course, anything," Jane replied, looking up from her cup of coffee. Laura took a deep breath. "I've been thinking, I can't keep doing this by myself. The bakery is doing well, but it's more than I can handle on my own. I need help. I need someone I can trust to manage the front of the shop so I can focus on the baking and maybe start to take care of myself a bit more." Jane's eyes softened with understanding. "Laura, I'm so glad you're asking for help. You've been carrying so much on your own, and it's okay to lean on others. If you're asking me to help out more, I'd be honored." Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I was actually thinking of offering you a permanent position here as the manager. I know it's a lot to ask, but you've been such a huge help already, and I trust you more than anyone. You know how much this bakery means to me, and I think you could help me make it something truly special." Jane smiled, her eyes bright with affection. "Laura, I would love to. I've always admired your passion for baking, and I believe in what you're doing here. Let's do this together." With Jane officially on board as the manager, Laura felt the first stirrings of hope. It wasn't just about easing her workload. It was about having someone she could confide in, someone who understood what this bakery meant to her and what she had gone through to make it a reality. Jane's presence brought a new energy to the shop, and together, they began to refine the business, improving operations and expanding the menu. As the weeks passed, Laura started to see the bakery not just as a tribute to Richard, but as a way to rebuild her life. She threw herself into her work, experimenting with new recipes and introducing special seasonal items that became instant hits with the customers. Jane took over the day-to-day management, handling the logistics and customer relations with ease, freeing Laura to focus on her true passion, baking. But the journey was far from smooth. There were still days when the grief threatened to overwhelm her. When the sight of a couple sharing a pastry or the sound of a love song on the radio would bring her to tears. There were times when the pressure of running a business seemed too much, and she doubted whether she could keep going. But each time, she reminded herself of why she had started this journey in the first place, and she found the strength to keep moving forward. One afternoon, as she was working on a new recipe for a chocolate torte, the doorbell rang, signaling a customer's arrival. Jane was busy with another customer, so Laura wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out of the kitchen to help. Standing in the doorway was a man she didn't recognize, but there was something familiar in his expression, something that tugged at a distant memory. He was holding a small bouquet of flowers, and as he stepped forward, he offered her a warm smile. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice gentle. "I don't know if you remember me, but I'm David Jenkins. I used to work with Richard." The name jolted something loose in her mind, and she suddenly remembered Richard mentioning a colleague named David, a younger man he had mentored in his last few years at work. Laura hadn't seen him since Richard's funeral, where everything had been a blur. "David," she said, surprised. "Of course I remember you. It's good to see you." "I'm sorry to just drop by like this," David said, his tone apologetic. "I've been meaning to visit for a while, but I didn't want to intrude. I brought these for you as a small gesture." Laura accepted the flowers, her heart aching at the kindness. "Thank you. They're lovely. Please, come in and have a seat." David followed her inside, glancing around the bakery with admiration. "This place is amazing. I remember Richard telling me about your baking. He was always so proud of you. I'm glad to see you've made your dream a reality." Laura smiled, touched by his words. "It's been a challenge, but it's also been a blessing. It helps keep me going." As they sat down at one of the tables, Laura felt a sense of comfort in David's presence. There was a connection between them, a shared understanding of the man they both had loved and respected. As they talked, David shared stories of his time working with Richard, stories Laura had never heard, and she found herself laughing and crying in equal measure. David had a gentle, reassuring way about him, and Laura realized how much she had missed having someone to talk to about Richard, someone who had known him in a different way. As the afternoon wore on, Laura felt the heaviness in her heart begin to lift, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. When David finally left, promising to return soon, Laura stood by the window, watching him walk down the street. She was still grieving, still trying to find her way without Richard, but she was also beginning to see that she wasn't as alone as she had feared. There were people who cared about her, who wanted to help her heal, and she was finally ready to let them in. Laura stood at the window, watching as David Jenkins disappeared down the street. The bouquet of flowers he had brought lay on the table beside her, filling the air with a soft, sweet scent. It had been a long time since anyone outside her close circle of friends had visited her with such warmth and kindness. As she gazed at the blooms, a tender smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in weeks. David's visit had stirred something in Laura, a realization that perhaps it was time to start letting people back into her life, to open herself up to the possibility of new relationships and experiences, even as she continued to honor Richard's memory. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Moving forward felt like betraying the past, and yet she knew that staying locked in grief would only keep her from truly living. The next morning, Laura awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. She dressed quickly, eager to get to the bakery, where the comforting routine of baking awaited her. The thought of David's visit lingered in her mind, bringing with it a warmth that carried her through the day. As she worked in the kitchen, rolling out dough and preparing the day's pastries, she found herself thinking about the stories David had shared about Richard. It was as if she had learned new facets of the man she had loved so deeply, seeing him through the eyes of someone who had admired him as much as she had. The realization brought her a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The days turned into weeks, and sweet remembrances continued to thrive. The bakery had become a cherished part of the community, and Laura found herself busier than ever. Jane's presence as manager was a godsend, allowing Laura to focus on the creative aspects of the business. With Jane handling the day-to-day operations, Laura had more time to experiment with new recipes, perfecting her signature cakes and introducing seasonal specialties that quickly became customer favorites. But even as the bakery flourished, Laura's grief remained a constant companion. There were days when she would be overcome by a wave of sadness, triggered by something as simple as a song on the radio or the sight of an old couple holding hands. The pain was still there, but it was no longer as sharp, no longer as paralyzing. It had softened into a deep, abiding ache that she carried with her, a reminder of the love she had lost and the life she was trying to rebuild. David became a regular visitor to the bakery, stopping by every week or so to check in on Laura and enjoy one of her pastries. Their conversations became a bright spot in her week, and she found herself looking forward to his visits. They talked about everything: his work, her struggles with the bakery, memories of Richard, and with each conversation, Laura felt herself growing more comfortable with the idea of moving forward. One afternoon, after a particularly busy morning, Laura sat down with David at one of the corner tables. The bakery was quiet, the lunch rush over, and the two of them had the place to themselves. As they sipped their tea, David glanced at her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Laura," he began, hesitating slightly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time we talked, about how hard it's been to move forward without Richard." Laura looked up, her heart tensing at the mention of her late husband's name. "It has been hard," she admitted softly. "Some days, I feel like I'm just going through the motions, trying to keep everything together. But inside, I'm still so lost without him." David nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I can't imagine how difficult it must be. Richard was an incredible man, and I know how much he meant to you. But I also see how strong you are, Laura. You've built something amazing here, something that honors his memory in a way that's beautiful and lasting." His words touched her deeply, and she felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, David. That means a lot to me." David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You've created a space where people feel welcome and cared for, a place where they can come and share a piece of their lives with you. That's a rare gift, Laura. But I also think it's important for you to take care of yourself, to find a way to be happy again." Laura bit her lip, the conflicting emotions swirling inside her. "I want to be happy," she said quietly, "but I don't know how to do that without feeling guilty, like I'm leaving Richard behind." "You're not leaving him behind," David said gently. "You're carrying him with you in everything you do, but you're also allowed to find new joys, new connections. Richard would want that for you, don't you think?" Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "He would. He always wanted me to be happy, to follow my dreams. But it's hard to let go of the sadness, to open myself up to something new." David reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to let go of the sadness completely. It's part of you now, part of your story. But that doesn't mean you can't find room for other things. Two things that bring you peace, and maybe even happiness." Laura squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding. "I think you're right," she said softly. "It's just going to take time." "And that's okay," David replied. "There's no rush. Take the time you need, but don't close yourself off to the possibilities. Life has a way of surprising us, even when we think we're not ready." As they sat together, the silence between them comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding, Laura felt something shift inside her. For the first time since Richard's death, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future that wasn't defined solely by her loss. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. As the weeks continued, Laura found herself slowly embracing the changes in her life. She began taking short breaks during the day, allowing herself time to breathe and reflect, rather than working herself to exhaustion. She and Jane developed a rhythm in the bakery that allowed Laura to step back occasionally, to enjoy the simple pleasures she had been denying herself. An afternoon walk, a quiet cup of tea, a visit with an old friend. David's visits became more frequent, and their friendship deepened. He was a kind and patient listener, never pushing her but always encouraging her to look forward, to find her own path to healing. Laura began to cherish their time together, finding in him a source of comfort and companionship that she hadn't realized she needed. One crisp autumn afternoon, after the bakery had closed for the day, David invited Laura for a walk by the river. The leaves were turning golden, the air was cool, and the soft sound of the water flowing beside them was soothing. They walked in silence for a while, enjoying the beauty of the season, before David spoke. "Laura, there's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, his voice careful. She glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" David stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "I've been thinking a lot about you, about us. I know we've both been through a lot, and I don't want to rush anything, but I care about you, Laura, more than just as a friend." Laura's breath caught in her throat, the words hanging in the air between them. She had sensed a growing closeness between them, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. It was real and it was terrifying. "I don't expect anything from you," David continued, his voice steady. "I just wanted you to know how I feel, and if you're not ready, that's okay. I'll always be here as your friend, no matter what." Laura felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Fear, guilt, confusion, and something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to reconcile the idea of moving forward with someone new while still mourning Richard. "David, she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. It's all so complicated. I miss Richard so much, and the thought of moving on, it feels like I'm betraying him." David's eyes softened with understanding. "You're not betraying him, Laura. You loved him deeply, and you always will. But that doesn't mean you can't find room in your heart for someone else. Love isn't a finite thing. It's something that grows, even when you think there's no room left." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes, and she looked away, struggling with the emotions swirling inside her. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. David reached out and gently lifted her chin, guiding her gaze back to his. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said softly. "Just know that I'm here, and I care about you. And whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Laura searched his eyes, seeing nothing but kindness and patience. She knew he was right. There was no rush, no pressure. But the possibility of opening herself up to love again, of finding happiness with someone new, was both terrifying and exhilarating. As they continued their walk, Laura's mind raced with thoughts of the future, of what might be possible if she could find the courage to take that step. She wasn't ready yet, but for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine it, to picture a life where she could hold Richard's memory close while also making room for something new, something beautiful. That night, as she lay in bed, the darkness no longer felt as overwhelming. There was still sadness, still the ache of loss, but there was also a spark of hope, a glimmer of light in the distance. And as she drifted off to sleep, Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she was moving forward, one step at a time. And for now, that was enough. The days following Laura's walk with David were filled with introspection. She went about her usual routines at the bakery, but her mind was often elsewhere, turning over the conversation they had shared by the river. The thought of opening her heart to someone new brought a mixture of emotions: hope, guilt, excitement, and fear. David's kindness and patience had touched her deeply, but the idea of moving forward, of allowing herself to feel something beyond grief, was both terrifying and liberating. One afternoon, as she was putting the finishing touches on a batch of raspberry tarts, Jane walked into the kitchen, her expression curious. "You seem lost in thought," Jane said, leaning against the counter. "Anything you want to talk about?" Laura hesitated, then sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's David," she admitted. "We've grown closer, and he told me how he feels about me. And now I'm a mess of emotions. I'm not sure what to do." Jane smiled gently. "I'm not surprised. Anyone with eyes can see that David cares about you. And honestly, Laura, you've been through so much. It's okay to let yourself be happy again. Richard wouldn't want you to be alone forever." Laura nodded, biting her lip. I know, but it's so hard. I still miss Richard every day, and I don't want to feel like I'm replacing him. Feels like a betrayal. Jane moved closer, placing a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder. You're not replacing him. You're adding a new chapter to your life, one that can coexist with the love you still have for Richard. It's not about forgetting him. It's about allowing yourself to live again. The words resonated with Laura, but the fear remained. What if I'm not ready? What if I hurt David because I'm still so caught up in the past? You'll never know unless you try, Jane said softly. And I think David understands what you're going through. He's not asking you to forget Richard. He's just offering you a chance to move forward at your own pace. Laura sighed, feeling the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. I don't know if I can do this. Jane gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. You don't have to decide anything right now. Take your time, figure out what you want. But don't close yourself off to the possibility of happiness. You deserve it, Laura. As Jane left the kitchen, Laura stood there for a moment, letting her friend's words sink in. She knew Jane was right. She needed to give herself permission to feel again, to explore the possibility of a future that included love and companionship. But how could she reconcile that with the deep love she still felt for Richard? The question stayed with her as she locked up the bakery that evening, the streets of Bedford quiet under the soft glow of the streetlights. As she walked home, the cool night air cleared her mind, and by the time she reached her front door, she had made a decision. The next day, Laura found herself at the riverbank again, the same place where she and David had talked. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet as she walked along the path, the river flowing gently beside her. She had called David that morning, asking if he could meet her here. Now, as she waited for him to arrive, her heart raced with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. When David finally appeared, his familiar warm smile put her at ease. He walked over to her, and for a moment, they stood in silence, taking in the beauty of the surroundings. Thank you for meeting me, Laura said softly, her hands fidgeting nervously. Of course, David replied, his eyes full of understanding. I'm glad you called. Laura took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation, and I want you to know that I care about you too. I really do. But I'm also still grieving Richard, and that makes everything so complicated. David nodded, his expression gentle. I understand, Laura. I never wanted to pressure you into anything. I just wanted to be honest about how I feel. I appreciate that, Laura said, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm scared, David. I'm scared of opening myself up to someone new, of feeling something other than grief. And I'm scared that if I do, it means I'm letting go of Richard, and I don't know if I'm ready for that. David reached out, taking her hands in his. You don't have to let go of Richard. He'll always be a part of you, a part of your life. But that doesn't mean you can't make room for something new, something that brings you joy. It's not about replacing him. It's about allowing yourself to heal and to live fully again. Laura felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of hope. I want to try, she whispered. I don't know how this will work or where it will lead, but I want to try. David's smile was full of warmth and reassurance. That's all I could ever ask for, Laura. We'll take it one day at a time, no pressure, no expectations. Just see where things go. Laura nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was making a choice for herself, not just reacting to her grief. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, with David by her side. Over the next few weeks, Laura and David began to spend more time together, slowly and cautiously exploring the possibility of a deeper relationship. They took walks through the countryside, had dinner at cozy little restaurants, and shared long conversations over coffee in the bakery. Each step they took felt like a delicate dance, balancing the past with the present, grief with hope. But as they grew closer, Laura found herself facing new challenges. The guilt she felt whenever she laughed at one of David's jokes, or when she caught herself enjoying his company, was a constant companion. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow betraying Richard by allowing herself to feel happiness again. One evening, after a particularly lovely day spent with David, Laura returned home and found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed photo of her and Richard on their wedding day. The familiar pang of sorrow tugged at her heart, but this time, it was mixed with something else, an understanding that Richard wouldn't want her to be trapped in her grief forever. As she looked at the photo, Laura spoke aloud, her voice soft but steady. "Richard, I miss you every day, and I always will. You were the love of my life, and nothing will ever change that. But I also know that you wouldn't want me to be alone, to be unhappy. I think you'd want me to find joy again, to keep living." The words felt like a release, a permission she had been waiting for but hadn't known she needed. As she wiped away a tear, Laura felt a sense of peace settle over her. It didn't erase the grief, but it made room for something new, something that could coexist with the love she still held for Richard. The next time Laura saw David, she was more at ease, more open to the possibilities. They continued to take things slowly, but the weight of guilt had lessened, replaced by a quiet acceptance that it was okay to move forward, to find happiness again. As their relationship deepened, David became a regular fixture in Laura's life, both at the bakery and outside of it. The townsfolk began to notice the change in Laura, the way her smiles came more easily, the lightness in her step. She was still grieving, but she was also healing, and that healing brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. One morning, as Laura was setting out the day's pastries, Jane walked in, a mischievous grin on her face. "I hear you and David have been spending a lot of time together," she teased, leaning on the counter. Laura blushed, but she couldn't help but smile. "We have. It's been nice. Really nice." Jane's grin softened into a warm smile. "I'm happy for you, Laura. You deserve this, more than anyone I know." Laura looked around the bakery, taking in the familiar surroundings that had become a second home to her. "It's still hard sometimes," she admitted, "but I'm starting to feel like I'm finding my way, like I'm finally learning how to balance the past with the present." Jane nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "That's all any of us can do. Find a way to move forward, while still honoring what we've lost. And you're doing a beautiful job of it, Laura." The words filled Laura with a sense of pride and gratitude. She had come so far from those dark days of grief and doubt, and though the journey wasn't over, she was no longer walking it alone. With David by her side and the support of her friends and community, Laura felt ready to embrace whatever the future held. As she continued to work in the bakery that day, Laura felt a lightness in her heart that she hadn't known in a long time. The bakery was thriving, her relationships were deepening, and she was beginning to believe in the possibility of happiness again. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time Laura was okay with that. She was learning to live with the ambiguity, to trust that she could find her way, one step at a time. And as she served her customers with a genuine smile, Laura knew that she was not only rebuilding her life, but also creating something new and beautiful out of the love and loss that had shaped her journey. Winter had settled over Bedford, painting the town in shades of white and gray. The days were shorter, the air crisper, and the warmth of sweet remembrances became a haven for those seeking refuge from the cold. Inside the bakery, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air, and the windows fogged up from the heat of the ovens. It was a busy season for Laura, with holiday orders piling up and customers streaming in for a taste of her special seasonal treats. Despite the hectic pace, Laura felt more at peace than she had in a long time. She and David had grown closer, their relationship blossoming in a way that felt natural and right. They spent more time together, both in the bakery and outside of it, sharing quiet dinners, long walks, and conversations that deepened their connection. The guilt that had once plagued Laura had started to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance that it was possible to honor Richard's memory while also opening her heart to new possibilities. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the bakery, Laura and David sat together in the cozy corner by the fireplace. The bakery was closed for the day, the chairs stacked on tables, and the lights dimmed to a soft glow. Laura had made them both a cup of hot cocoa, and they sat in companionable silence, watching the snow fall gently outside. "This place feels like home," David said, his voice warm with affection as he glanced around the bakery. Laura smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It does, doesn't it? I never thought I'd find so much comfort in this little shop, especially after everything that's happened. But now, I can't imagine my life without it." David nodded, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "You've created something truly special here, Laura. It's more than just a bakery. It's a place where people feel welcome, where they can find a bit of happiness in their day. And you've done that even while carrying so much pain. That's something to be proud of." His words brought a lump to Laura's throat, and she blinked back tears. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm starting to see the light again, starting to believe that there's a future beyond the grief." David turned to her, his expression serious. "Laura, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about, something important." Laura's heart skipped a beat at the tone in his voice. She pulled back slightly to look at him, searching his eyes for clues. "What is it?" David hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I've been offered a job, a promotion, actually. It's a great opportunity, but it's in London." Laura's breath caught in her throat. "London? That's far." David nodded, his gaze steady. "It is. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I didn't want to say anything until I knew for sure. But now that the offer is official, I had to tell you." The news hit Laura like a wave, knocking the breath out of her. London was hours away by train, and the thought of David leaving, of their growing relationship being tested by distance, filled her with a mix of fear and sadness. She hadn't realized just how much she had come to rely on him, how much he had become a part of her life. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at her, his expression tender but conflicted. "That depends. The job is a great opportunity, but I don't want to leave you, Laura. Not when things are just starting to come together for us. I care about you too much to just walk away." Laura's heart ached at the sincerity in his words, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. She knew how much this promotion meant to David, how hard he had worked for it. And as much as she wanted him to stay, she couldn't ask him to give up his dreams for her. "You have to do what's right for you," she said softly, though the words felt like they were tearing her apart. "This is a big opportunity, and you've earned it. I don't want to hold you back." David's eyes softened with sadness. "You wouldn't be holding me back, Laura. But I can't ask you to pick up and move to London either. You've built your life here, and I know how much this bakery means to you." The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Laura felt the familiar pang of grief resurface, mingling with the new fear of losing David. She had already lost so much, and the thought of losing him too was almost too much to bear. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. David reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not going to lose me, Laura. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. But we need to figure out what's best for both of us, even if it's not easy." Laura nodded, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them easy. She knew that long-distance relationships were difficult, especially with the demands of her bakery and the new pressures David would face in London. But the idea of him leaving, of them being apart, filled her with dread. Over the next few days, Laura wrestled with the decision, torn between her love for David and the reality of their situation. She knew she couldn't ask him to stay, couldn't hold him back from pursuing his dreams, but the thought of facing life without him was unbearable. As the days passed, David continued to visit the bakery, and they tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the tension between them was palpable. Every conversation, every shared glance, was tinged with the knowledge that their time together might be running out. They avoided talking about the future, focusing instead on the present. But the unspoken fears hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. One evening, as they sat together in the bakery after closing, David broke the silence. "Laura, we need to talk about this. We can't keep avoiding it." Laura looked up from her cup of tea, her heart heavy. "I know. I don't know what to say." I don't want you to go, but I can't ask you to stay either. David reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I don't want to leave you, Laura, but this opportunity is something I've been working toward for a long time. If I don't take it, I'll always wonder what might have been. Laura nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I understand. You have to follow your dreams, just like I did with the bakery. David squeezed her hand, his expression filled with love and regret. I've been thinking, maybe we could try the long-distance thing at least for a while, see how it goes. I could come back on weekends and we could talk every day. The idea brought a flicker of hope to Laura's heart, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. What if it doesn't work? What if we grow apart? David's gaze was steady, but she could see the same doubts reflected in his eyes. We won't know unless we try. I don't want to give up on us, Laura. But I also don't want to make you miserable. Laura took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't want to give up on us either. But I'm scared, David. I'm scared of losing you. Scared of being alone again. David stood up, moving around the table to sit beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and Laura buried her face in his chest, letting the tears come. They sat like that for a long time, the warmth of his embrace a small comfort in the face of their uncertain future. Finally, David spoke, his voice gentle but firm. Laura, whatever happens, I want you to know that I love you, and I'll do everything I can to make this work, if that's what you want. But we need to be honest with each other, and with ourselves. Laura nodded against his chest, her heart breaking but resolved. I love you too, David, and I want to try. I'm just so scared. David kissed the top of her head, holding her tightly. I know, I am too, but we'll face it together whatever comes. As they sat there in the quiet bakery, holding on to each other, Laura felt the weight of the decision settle over her. It wasn't going to be easy, but she knew she had to face it, just as she had faced every other challenge in her life. She had survived the worst of her grief, and now she had to find the strength to move forward, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. In the days that followed, Laura and David made their plans. He would take the job in London, and they would try the long-distance relationship at least for a while. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to give it a chance. The night before David was set to leave, they spent the evening together in the bakery, reminiscing about the time they had shared and talking about the future. There was a sadness in the air, but also a sense of hope, a belief that they could make this work, if they were both committed. As they said their goodbyes the next morning, standing on the train platform in Bedford, Laura felt a mix of emotions. Love, fear, hope, and sadness. She held on to David for as long as she could, not wanting to let go, but knowing she had to. I'll be back soon, David whispered, kissing her softly. And we'll talk every day. We'll make this work, Laura. Laura nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I love you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I love you too, David replied, his own eyes glistening with tears. Always. As the train pulled away, Laura stood on the platform, watching until it disappeared from view. The emptiness in her heart was overwhelming, but she knew that this was a test of their love, a challenge they had to face if they were going to build a future together. When she returned to the bakery that morning, the familiar smells and sounds brought her a small measure of comfort. She threw herself into her work, focusing on the tasks at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting back to David, to the uncertainty of their future. Days turned into weeks, and Laura found herself adjusting to the new reality. She and David talked every day, their phone calls and video chats a lifeline that kept them connected. He came back to Bedford on weekends when he could, and those precious hours together were filled with love and longing, but also a growing understanding of the challenges they faced. The distance was hard, and there were times when Laura felt overwhelmed by the loneliness, by the fear that they were drifting apart. But each time those doubts crept in, she reminded herself of the strength they had both shown, of the love that had brought them together in the first place. One cold winter evening, after a particularly difficult day at the bakery, Laura sat alone in the quiet shop, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The holiday season was in full swing, and the bakery was busier than ever, but the weight of David's absence was heavy on her heart. As she stared out the window, watching the snow fall gently on the empty street, Laura felt the familiar ache of grief resurface, mingling with the new pain of missing David. She thought about everything they had been through, the love they had found in each other, and the challenges that still lay ahead. And in that moment, Laura realized something important. She had been so focused on the fear of losing David, on the uncertainty of their future, that she had forgotten to trust in the strength of their love. They had come this far, through grief and loss, through doubt and fear, and they had found something beautiful in each other. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees, but Laura knew that she couldn't let fear hold her back any longer. She had learned that life was unpredictable, that it could change in an instant, and that the only way to truly live was to embrace the uncertainty, to take the leap, and to trust in the love that had carried her this far. With a deep breath, Laura set down her cup of tea and stood up, a new resolve settling over her. She was ready to face whatever came next, to fight for the love she had found, and to build a future that honored both the past and the possibilities that lay ahead. And as she locked up the bakery that night, stepping out into the cold winter air, Laura felt a sense of peace. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced her fears, and now, she was ready to embrace whatever the future held. As winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Bedford began to shake off its chilly layers. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new life, and the days grew longer, bringing with them the promise of warmth and renewal. For Laura, the changing season mirrored the shifts within her heart. The weeks of distance between her and David had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and longing, but they had also strengthened their bond, revealing the depth of their commitment to each other. The bakery had continued to thrive during those months. Laura had thrown herself into her work, finding solace in the rhythm of baking and the joy it brought to her customers. Jane's steady presence as manager allowed Laura to take the occasional trip to London to visit David. Each visit a bittersweet reminder of the life they were trying to build together, despite the distance. But as much as Laura cherished their time together, the strain of maintaining a long-distance relationship was undeniable. The weekends in London were wonderful, filled with laughter and love, but they always ended too soon, leaving her with a hollow ache as she returned to Bedford. The phone calls and video chats were comforting, but they couldn't replace the warmth of David's embrace or the comfort of his presence beside her. One particularly beautiful spring day, Laura found herself in London, having made the trip to surprise David. She had arranged for Jane to cover the bakery for the weekend, allowing her a rare break. As she stepped off the train and made her way to David's apartment, her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nervousness. When she arrived at his door, David's expression of surprise and joy made the journey worth every mile. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as if he never wanted to let go. "I can't believe you're here," he murmured against her hair, his voice filled with warmth. "This is the best surprise I could have asked for." Laura smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I missed you," she admitted softly. "I couldn't wait any longer." David kissed her gently, his hands cupping her face as he looked into her eyes. "I've missed you too, more than you know." The weekend they spent together was magical, filled with long walks through the blooming parks, lazy mornings spent in bed, and quiet dinners in the cozy corners of London's hidden gems. But as the hours slipped away, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in a bubble, a temporary escape from the reality that loomed ever closer. On their last night together, as they sat by the window in David's apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Laura felt a heaviness settle over her. She knew that their time together was drawing to a close, that soon she would have to return to Bedford, and the cycle of distance and longing would begin again. "David," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how we're going to make this work." David turned to her, his expression serious but loving. "I've been thinking about it too, Laura. I know this hasn't been easy for either of us, and I don't want to keep doing this if it's only going to hurt you." Laura swallowed hard, her emotions swirling inside her. I love you, David, but I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Keep pretending that the distance doesn't matter when it does. I hate being apart from you, and I hate that our time together is always so limited. David nodded, his eyes reflecting the same struggle. I hate it too, Laura. Every time you leave, it feels like I'm losing a part of myself. But I don't want to ask you to give up your life in Bedford, to give up the bakery. I know how much it means to you. Laura took a deep breath, the decision she had been wrestling with for weeks finally coming into focus. I've been thinking about that too. And the truth is, the bakery is important to me, but you're more important. I don't want to keep living in two different worlds, constantly missing you and wondering what might have been. David's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope lighting up his face. What are you saying, Laura? I'm saying that I want to be with you, Laura said, her voice steady with resolve. Not just on weekends or over the phone, but every day. I want us to build a life together, to see where this love can take us. And if that means leaving Bedford, leaving the bakery, then I'm willing to do that. David stared at her, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Are you sure, Laura? I don't want you to make this decision out of fear or pressure. I want you to be happy, truly happy. Laura reached out, taking his hands in hers. I am sure. I've thought about it so much, and I've realized that the bakery isn't what's holding me together. It's you. You're the one who's helped me heal, who's shown me that there's life beyond grief. And I want to see what that life looks like with you. Tears filled David's eyes, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he was afraid she might disappear. I love you, Laura, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I love you so much, and I promise, I'll do everything I can to make you happy. Laura held onto him tightly, her own tears falling freely now. We'll make it work, David. Together. The decision made, a sense of peace settled over Laura. It wasn't an easy choice, leaving Bedford, leaving the bakery, but it was the right one. She had spent so long clinging to the past, to the life she had known with Richard. But now she was ready to embrace the future, to see where this new chapter would take her. In the days that followed, Laura began the process of transitioning out of the bakery. She and Jane had a long conversation, and to Laura's relief, Jane expressed interest in taking over the business. It was a perfect solution. Jane had been an integral part of Sweet Remembrances from the start, and Laura knew she would continue to nurture the bakery with the same love and care. As they worked together to finalize the details, Laura felt a sense of closure. The bakery had been her sanctuary, her lifeline during the darkest days of her grief. But now it was time to pass it on, to trust that it would continue to thrive without her. The day she handed over the keys to Jane was bittersweet. The two women embraced, both tearful but full of hope for the future. You're going to do amazing things here, Jane, Laura said, her voice thick with emotion. This place is in good hands. Jane smiled through her tears, squeezing Laura's hand. Thank you, Laura. I'll take good care of it, I promise. And I'll make sure it's always a place where people feel welcome, just like you did. With the bakery in capable hands, Laura felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had made peace with her decision, and now she was ready to move forward, to build a new life with David in London. On the day of her move, Laura stood in the empty apartment she had shared with Richard, the walls bare and the rooms echoing with memories. She walked through each room one last time, letting the memories wash over her. The laughter, the love, the life they had built together. It was hard to say goodbye, but she knew that Richard would have wanted her to be happy, to find love again. As she closed the door behind her, Laura felt a sense of finality, but also a sense of anticipation. She was leaving behind the life she had known, but she was also stepping into a new chapter, one filled with hope and possibility. David was waiting for her at the train station, his face lighting up when he saw her. He wrapped her in his arms, holding her close as if to reassure her that they were making the right choice. Are you ready? He asked, his voice full of love. Laura looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. I'm ready. As they boarded the train together, Laura felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past was a part of her, always would be, but it no longer held her back. She had faced her fears, honored her memories, and now she was ready to embrace the future. As the train pulled away from Bedford, carrying her toward a new life with David, Laura gazed out the window, watching the familiar landscape pass by. She felt a mixture of emotions, nostalgia, sadness, excitement, but above all, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the love she had known, for the strength she had found, and for the new beginnings that awaited her. And as the train sped toward London, toward a new chapter in her life, Laura knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Moving forward, with love in her heart and hope in her soul. Laura's journey from grief to renewal is complete, and she has found the strength to honor her past while embracing the possibilities of the future. This story is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the courage it takes to move forward, even in the face of uncertainty.